Jason Spangler, the SanteeSwapper. I'm here with Bill Mulrenin, the New York State OA trader. This is our second edition of the Scouting Hot Finds Insiders Roundtable. Bill, how's it going up there in New York?
Good, good. Some of the snow is finally starting to melt. How's it down with you?
Oh yeah, yesterday it got up almost to 70 degrees. It was the prettiest day of 2021, so we're hoping for more of that for sure.
That would be great. I think it'll be a while before I see 70 up here.
So today, just to let everybody know, we're going to be focusing on the Blue Book, and really maybe it would be better to say the idea of cataloging Order of the Arrow issues. Bill and I were talking in the pre-call, and we're going to kind of go way back into the 70s just to kind of tell the whole story, because I like to hear the history of it. And Bill's got a few more gray hairs than me, so he lived some of that history, and he can give us some firsthand knowledge. So just to kind of set this up, Bill was a New York State Blue Book editor starting in the early 2000s, and he worked on a little bit of the third edition, and then definitely fourth, fifth, and sixth editions of the Blue Book. He was the New York State editor. So he was right in the middle of it, and he can really talk to that effort, and we can kind of get into that. But Bill, let's kind of start by going back in time. I didn't start collecting Order of the Arrow patches until the 80s, and I kind of started with Arapaho. But let's go before that. Let's talk about the beginnings of this back with Bill Price, or maybe even there's another one that you can tell us about.
Yeah, well, the earlier collecting guides were more pocket-sized, and Bill Price, who you reference, would put them out every year or every other year. And a lot of those, while advanced for the time, were a pocket-sized book. It would show one of the more recent flap issues from the lodge, would have the council name, the lodge name. Back then, a lot more patches had restrictions on them, so it would have information, you know, if it was one per life, no trading, or one per activity, or unrestricted. And some of the editions would also show the what we know today from cataloging, the letter codes, and would give you an idea what had been issued by the lodge. You know, there might be a line like FFSSAAX, you know, which would just show that the lodge had two twills, whatever I just said, three solids, an arrowhead, and an odd shape, but it wouldn't give you any of the detail on that. But when you would go to a national event or a local event, you might have that book in your pocket, and you could refer to that to know what lodges you had and what you needed. I mean, back then, more people seemed to be going for name and number sets. Every active number that was out there, or every name that ever existed for lodges that had merged. And by the early 70s or mid 70s, the Order of the Arrow was going through a series of lodge consolidations and mergers. So that information, you know, was important to know or understand when it came out. Arapaho, I think, came out, I'm going to say it was 1979. I'd have to go back and find my old hard copy to use it. But that was one of the original guides that tried to list everything that was issued by each lodge. There was a small number of individuals led by Al Hugavine and Dave Lubitz. And it also had pictures of virtually every item that was known, or a significant percentage of what was known at the time. So that was, you know, the basic guides. The Arapaho was 8.5 by 11, 3-hole punched, and would, you know, be in a big binder. So that wasn't carried around by many people. Since it was a relatively small number of people producing that, that led to the concept of the Blue Book. And although I wasn't in the earliest stages of that, you know, I've heard some of the details over the years and talked to people who were involved in the early stages. But Jeff Morley and Bill Topkis put together a team of regional and state editors who would provide input for the book. Rob Cutts, who's still active collecting, started out as the New York editor because he handled the collection of the sale of the collection of a major New York collector back in the day, Don Vanderbilt. So he had a lot of the, he had pictures of Don's collection, and that provided a lot of the initial data for all the New York lodges. And New York is a large collecting entity. I haven't kept the number up to date, but at one time there were over 70 lodges that had been in New York State. All the old names and the current lodges. I'm sure we're somewhere in the 80s these days, although there's only about 15 active lodges. But Rob Cutts, started the New York project and handed it off to Bob Connor out of Suffolk County. Bob was a first solid and first twill collector early on, before first flaps were really a big thing. That was one of his hooks, but he also collected New York State. So he became the first full-time, I'll call it, New York State editor. And I used to see Bob at a lot of the local traderies. And by then I had gotten away from names and numbers and was collecting New York issues myself. So as I found new items or items that weren't in his list, I would feed him information. He had some medical issues in the late '90s, and I became active and then became the Blue Book editor. I helped out a little bit with the editing on the third Blue Book, but for the fourth, fifth, and sixth editions, I was the New York editor.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I want to get into that and pick up the story right there, but you have kind of given us a very wide arc of starting at Bill Price, Arapaho, Al Hugavine, Dave Lubitz, and then picking up. So let's go back to the beginning, and I want to just illustrate this for people a little bit more. I just recently bought a collection from a guy who was a collector in the late 60s and 70s, and he had each edition of these little Bill Price books, and I'll throw them up on the screen here. And in each book, it's literally like a time capsule. I can go back and see how his collection grew, and he was marking off in the book which ones he had. And as you described, it was kind of an alphabet soup of A and F and S and whatever for each lodge. But in the book, you only had one picture of one random flap. So it really was not terribly helpful to really know what the round looked like or what the twill looked like versus the solid, because you just had the bare bones information. How did you guys collect with those books back in the day?
Well, I think people were mainly looking for a single item from each lodge. It was people, aside from your home lodge, not a lot of people seemed to be collecting every issue, from every lodge sort of thing. I remember Don Perry, another old-time collector who was very big with the 75th anniversary of the OA. He was trying to collect 6 issues from each active lodge, so he could fill a page in his binder with 6 different issues from a given lodge. But most people, were checklist collectors. They needed one Unami, and at the time one Sanhican and one Nawakwa, and whatever, and they would just work through the number set. So you would get, and people traded by mail because there was no internet more often. So you would get a list saying, I needed a 4, 8, 10, 12, and 17, and those are the items I'm trying to collect in the short term. And then people branched out from that, once they became more involved with individual issues. And I think just the number of items made people focus their collections. They became more regional or area type collections just because the volume of items available. I don't remember all the exact numbers, but I'm going to say the first Blue Book, there was 10 or 15,000 issues in it, and that was considered a very large amount. And then it grew by leaps and bounds with each printing.
Right. So just to give you an example, and this is, again, I like this because we're going back in time. When I got this collection and in these Bill Price books, and I can see by when I sorted the collection out, there were some lodges that literally only had 1, 2, or 3 patches. And so, maybe their listing was like A because their first patch was an arrowhead, F, maybe two Fs and an S, like that was their whole thing. But then one lodge, I remember Lodge 307 from Texas, Karen Kawa, is that how you pronounce it? I'm not sure. These Indian names always give me a hard time. But they had it was a long one, right? Because they had a bunch of flaps with different border colors. And so to take it forward, the next evolution was Arapaho. And you tell me, because you were there, my thinking of the breakthrough of Arapaho was having Dave Lubitz's collection photographed. And now we had actual images of what the A and the R and the S and the F looked like. I actually interviewed Al Hugavine for one of my podcasts, and he talked about the setup. I think maybe it was at his house, and they had this, sort of diagram. You might remember the little millimeter grid diagram that all of the photographs were taken on. But how was having the pictures kind of a bit of a game changer?
Well, that was certainly a game changer. Then you knew what people actually saw. I don't know if you have them, and I didn't really think to try and pull them now, but there is a section conclave or an area conclave at the time from northwestern New York State that people were using to fake the R1 from Tuscarora Lodge 284, because the design was identical, but the background color was red on the conclave patch and blue on the R1 from the lodge. And what people did is they cut out the outer border of the conclave patch where it said, whatever it was, the area 2E 19, I don't remember, 55 conclave patch, and then we're putting that off as the R1 from Lodge 284, which was one of those traditional small lodges with only a few traders that always seemed to be a tough one. And because people only knew that the lodge had a round, people were able to get away with that sort of thing, at least in some circles. With the addition of Arapaho, you had a listing that the R1 was actually blue, and I think a yellow cut edge, if I remember, and whatever the other characteristics were. And there was and there was an actual picture of the item. And then there was, I think they listed it as a ZR1. There was, the round, the cut down conclave round, but it showed that had a red background. So by having a lot of the additional detail and pictures, you were much better able to tell if you were getting a real 284 R1, or if it was, if it was the fake. And it wasn't just that lodge, but other fakes were able to be more clearly identified. I'm a New York guy, so Scanando Lodge comes to mind. There are several fakes of their first flap, the F1. So knowing the differences, being able to see clearly the differences between the real, excuse me, and the fake, started to empower collectors and make them feel more secure in completing a trade.
All right, so we're not going to go through the whole history of Arapaho, although it is kind of interesting, but let's just sort of say, for argument's sake, basically in the 1980s kind of is that time period where Arapaho is really what people were using. And there was a supplement that came out later that was more of just a typed up list, again, as they're assigning numbers and such. But and this is not meant to beat up on Al Hugavine, but we want to talk about how then it morphs into Blue Book. Sort of the issues with Arapaho become that it's sort of there's not a big team working on it. It's a smaller group, maybe not quite just one person, maybe, but there's a lot of things probably being missed. And another complaint I heard, again, this is before my time, was that Arapaho would also renumber issues as they found out new information and said, oh, this one came before this one. Well, let's just move them around. So what used to be the S5 would then become the S4, and which was sort of correcting a mistake. But as going into the Blue Book era, we know that was one of their really hard and fast rules. So can you kind of talk a little bit about why you think things were just the need for the Blue Book effort? I know we can't get in the minds of Bill and Topicus and Morley, but kind of talk about that transition.
Sure. And as you point out, that was an issue probably for some of the bigger collectors, and certainly for the dealers at the time. Every time a new edition of Arapaho came out, you potentially had to re-identify, hundreds or maybe even thousands of patches, or at least determine that a particular lodge didn't have any changes. So you would have, a Herculean effort. If you were a major collector, you would have, hundreds or thousands of issues you would need to recheck, and all your duplicates would need to be, renumbered potentially, because you didn't want to say you were trading, an S3 when now it was an S4. Blue Book, one of their initial policies, and they pretty much stuck to it with limited exceptions for its entire lifetime, that the S1 or the S2, whatever the issue was always going to be the S2. It was never going to be renumbered. They might note something in the description that this is actually the first flap and not the S1, if enough information came out. And what they introduced was the concept of decimal numbering, which, if you found an issue that came out between the S2 and S5, or the S2 and S3, instead of renumbering the entire rest of the lodge, you would create an S2.5. So you knew numerically it came between the 2 and the 3, but it didn't require the entire lodge to, be renumbered with all the subsequent issues. And as you said, some of the lodges that by then, and we're talking, middle to late 90s and into the 2000s, lodges tended to have more than a handful of issues by that time. It was uncommon for there to be 100 plus issues, but there were certainly lodges that had dozens of issues. And if a newer early issue was found, that could have involved a significant amount of renumbering.
Now, the other thing that the Blue Book did, which I really like, even today, I really do appreciate this, because I've been using my first edition Blue Book recently to help identify the collection I mentioned earlier. In the listing, all of the items were listed not by category or not by letter, if you will, but by chronological order. So if you had the A1 and then the A2 and then maybe it was the F1 or then there was an X that came in there, they tried to put everything in order, which I really like. But you tell me, was that something that was kind of revolutionary, or how did that help?
Well, that was a change at the time. Arapaho, as I recall, but it's been a long time since I've used it for identification purposes. But that was more, all the A's and all the F's and all the S's or whatever it might be for a lodge. So that did give you a feel for the chronology of the issues. Again, wasn't always 100% accurate, but it was at least a best attempt. Although what was also revolutionary with the Blue Book is, in addition to the hard copy printout, they also included, they also went to a CD version where you could upload the program into your computer. Not too many laptops at the time, but upload the program in the computer. It had images then, and you also had the ability to sort either chronologically or alphabetically. So depending on what your preference was, you could sort the information either way.
Yeah, and ironically, if anyone comes across any of those CDs, which a few dealers I think still have stashes of them, they require a very old operating system that most of us don't have anymore. I think maybe Windows 95 or Windows 7 or something, and so they're actually kind of obsolete to use. But irregardless, were there any other hard and fast rules that the Blue Book used that you want to mention? I know, for example, we said no renumbering. They did introduce the idea of decimals, chronological order. Can you think of any other things that kind of stand out and sort of the rules that basically tried to, I always use this term in my normal talk, like herd the cats. Like you have all these lodges that did all these things all over the country. How did they try to sort of standardize cataloging OA?
Yeah, they did a few different things. the original Arapaho only categorized patches. It didn't include neckerchiefs unless it was the patch from a neckerchief. So the earlier Arapahos started including neckerchiefs. Um, they would list the patch if it was, a pie-shaped patch or whatever, but an embroidered or a silk screen neckerchief would get listed as a separate issue, and that didn't exist in the Arapaho world. So that was, people became more active in collecting neckerchiefs because there was now checklists available from each lodge. In later editions, they also added event issues, which, although local people tended to collect them, they were never cataloged on a national level. Your lodge fellowship or conclave banquet, whatever you might have issued a patch for, that was a sub area that people collected, and that had never been before. So they added that. They created the concept of the event issue, which we see now with the small e in the list. So an ES 2000 would be a solid flap that was issued for an event held in 2000. Or the ER 1996 was around for a 1996 event. And then since a lot of lodges had multiple events in a given year, they added a formatting to show that, this was the fourth event issue or the third event issue that was issued for the lodge for a given year. They also added chapter issues, which were again never cataloged on any national platform. So they greatly widened what was, to some extent, I guess, an acceptable collectible. Again, checklist collectors say, "Oh, now I have a checklist. I know what to look for." And I know a lot of my early time with the Blue Book was finding all those unlisted event and chapter issues that hadn't been previously cataloged. And even today, those are still the most likely items to be found, when you're cataloging collections or looking at collections. So, a number of things, like you say, decimal issues, not renumbering, adding neckerchiefs, adding event patches, adding chapter issues. Those were a number of things that Blue Book did that hadn't been done, in previous collecting guides.
All right, so I think we've laid out several ways that the Blue Book kind of revolutionized Order of the Arrow collecting. And you lived during that time, and I started collecting during that time. And so just to anyone watching, I think that Order of the Arrow collecting kind of really exploded. And all this comes in conjunction with 1995 is when eBay forms as a company. And although in the very early years, the Boy Scout category was very small, it didn't take long before it started to grow. And then you have more lodges and, increasing how much they're putting out. And so Order of the Arrow collecting kind of really takes off, I think, in the 2000s. But what I want to do, since we have you on here and you were a Blue Book editor, can we kind of talk about a little bit of the nuts and bolts of how did that work in terms of, like, you're the state editor, and you, as I understand, have a regional editor, and then there's some national editors, but then you also have to then, as you said, there's over history 70 lodges in New York. How did you then compile that list that had to be updated for the next edition?
Well, I mean, physically, it was an Excel file, and there were finally 3 tabs that had to be completed in certain formats. One for what I'll call the standard lodge issues, one for event issues, and one for chapter issues, because there were different required fields, and this would allow the national editors to upload those and not have to rekey potentially hundreds of issues that had cropped up between the books. As a matter of fact, I still use that format for my list today, I guess more as a legacy or for ease of keeping the data, because after Blue Book 6 was published, I continued to keep the list in a format that would have allowed me to upload it for Blue Book 7. Matter of fact, I think the file is still named Blue Book 7 Update, as it's traveled from computer to computer, over the last 15 years or so. So yes, I would I would send my file. Typically, I would go directly to Bill Topkis. He would put out a call for updates. He would send he would request the format it be sent in, and I had by that point was maintaining it in that format and would send it out to him. And then I would usually get something back shortly afterward, showing what had been uploaded, and it would also include if he got some random information from from other sources. I seen you mentioned Connolly Williams just the other day in something I was listening to. Connolly had gone through and wound up adding a lot of A and B issues as he examined his sales stock. Connolly, for those who may remember, was the Heart of Texas trader, I believe, and produced a sale list. So he created a number of A and B issues that previously had been unlisted, whether they were twill directions or color varieties or whatever it might have been. But 98% plus of the New York editions were basically items that either I had personally collected or found about from local collectors within the various lodges, and that I submitted up the chain. Time wise, the call would usually go out in January. For information. I would get something back sometime in the February-March timeframe, but they would, and then I might be able to send in, a relative handful of editions, that I'm for items I might have found out in January or February, but then everything would be locked down because the book would have to be printed, and the printing they would normally be distributed around the NOAC of that year. Either right before or right after NOAC. I think they usually had them available at the pre-NOAC tradery, back in the day. But so the 2006 edition, which I believe was Blue Book 6, if I remember correctly, that would have went to bed in January of 2006, February of 2006. So it wouldn't contain most of the 06 NOAC issues. And then it would have been available, in the July-August timeframe, the previous editions as printed volumes. By the last Blue Book, there was only CDs being produced because of the size. I believe Johnny Pleasance, and you would have to check with him, but I believe he printed 100 hard copies of the final Blue Book, which was a significant expense and a significant cost. I didn't buy one. I was happy using the CD version at the time. And one other thing which I just recalled is the Blue Book software allowed you to upload images yourself. So if you found images that weren't in their database, you could upload the images within your own version of the software to help you understand your own collection and what your needs might be if you found a picture of it somewhere.
Well, Bill, I think we're going to sort of wrap it there. In my mind, I'm thinking, okay, now we can talk about what's after Blue Book and what happens in 2008 or, OA images. There's lots of other things, but, we got to save some topics for future roundtables. We can't just fire all our ammunition at once. And so I think that I just want to sort of end this by saying that there's so much to talk about with the Blue Book. We really haven't got into Morley and Topkis, who are the national editors. We haven't mentioned there was just dozens and dozens of regional editors through the years, state editors, et cetera. This was a huge thing. We're not trying to give the whole history of it, but this was kind of your experience as being a Blue Book editor and my experience as being a collector who was younger, starting off in college and stuff, and have my copy of the Blue Book going to traderies. So hopefully it's kind of gotten people interested in all this. And definitely it gives me the idea that there's other topics for us to cover, go down those rabbit holes. And like I said, we'll save those for another day.
Sounds like a plan.